control whatsoever. And yet when we look through history, and I mean, you must understand, you must remember that prohibition and the global control system that we've discussed, this is only 100 years old this year. It didn't exist 100 years ago, or 101 years ago. It just wasn't there. And so, what were people doing for the previous 30,000, 40,000 years? So, how do we look at the practice of drug use in contemporary society? How is it culturally embedded? What practices occur, and are these practices that link it to some type of meaning? When we looked at the Enlightenment and at the colonial period, I think one of the most important things was the transformation of both substances that were being used, changing from, if we think about Europe, the old world substances, which included quite full-on psychotropics, such as datura, for example, and these were evidenced by, for example, in the witch trials and so on, where people reported quite powerful and transcendent drug experiences. But with the Enlightenment, there was a shift promoted by trade to the use of new substances from the so-called New World, tea, coffee and chocolate. And I think what was really important about that was also driven by the needs of capitalism. Okay? And there's two areas there. One area is this, the business of trade itself. These products became commodities, and so they were traded, and so that they came into Europe, for example. The other thing is to remember also that the new substances that we're talking about fitted well with the requirements of capitalism, moving from an agrarian-based culture with seasonal work to very much a more urban context where people were required to be at work, to do work, and to do work for a consistent period of time every day. And they also had the substances such as tea and coffee and so on also had the advantage of reducing people's appetites. The transformation of use, both in terms of the types of substances being used and also the style of use. And then we looked at the globalised the development of globalised drug control, and again the issue there related to this rationalising process, which was also part of the Enlightenment, and in relation to that also the development of, I guess, particular sets of protocols by certain groups which were starting to emerge as preeminent groups which controlled knowledge, and particularly medical knowledge. And the two groups that we looked at in particular were the American Medical Association and the American Pharmacists Association, and their desire to take control of drugs. And so drugs became something that was controlled much more by medicine. They became controlled in terms of their quality, in terms of their particular attributes, and in terms of how they were prescribed and dispensed. And this notion of medical control is something that then carried over into policy, and for various other reasons, including the economic aspirations of America, there was then a development of international drug control based around the idea of, from America's point of view, wanting to get into China and develop markets there, looking at opium and saying this is an area where we want to develop, where we can perhaps put forward some desire for control. All the other drugs were drawn into this as well, cocaine and Indian hemp, otherwise known as cannabis. And that set the platform for the kinds of international global controls that we have today. And so you have these idea of typical data, and you've got epidemiological data and medical data. And epidemiological data was some of the stuff we looked at last week in relation to my own work, where you ask the questions: what are you using? How often are you using? Where do you use? When do you use? How much? What's the intensity of use? These sorts of things. And these do give you a sense of drug use, but they don't really add a lot to meaning, as far as I'm concerned, anyway. And so you also have this idea of the problematic method, where by having just a medical questionnaire, if you're only going to ask questions about the medical aspect of substance use, you're in a situation where the method, the questions that you're asking are actually going to generate the answers. And so if you ask questions about people's pathology around their drug use, about the problems they have, they're going to tell you, well, yeah, these are the problems I have. And so then, of course, these answers get turned into papers and academic journals. And someone reads, oh, cannabis users experience this, this, and this. When we asked them, they said they experienced these things. Well, yeah, that's because we asked them, and they told us, But did we ask them any other questions? Did we ask them about the meaningfulness of their experiences? Did we ask them why they do it? Did we have an open-ended approach to trying to understand the relevance of cannabis use to them? So there tends to be this focus on pathology, and users are constructed through that discourse, it's an academic discourse, or it's through the media, in a negative context. Now, what Foucault was talking about there is the power of medical discourse to take on a particular authority about discussing drug use, or something, some medical phenomenon, in this case drug use. And he proposes that there are other discourses out there, but that these other discourses don't have the same authority as the medical discourse. And as a consequence, even though someone might say something, might express something, and the example we had was when Abe presented to us a couple of sessions ago, and he talked about his experiences as a cannabis activist, that his experience, his knowledge is denied. It's not legitimate knowledge. And this is a very strong element in the predominating discourse. And we kind of examine this a little bit with the work on semiotics. And it's, in a sense, it's convoluted, and in one way it seems obvious, and in another way it's quite subtle. But what you end up with is a powerful dominating discourse that looks only at certain aspects of the phenomenon and doesn't look at a broader or more holistic attitude, which is the approach. The holistic approach is the approach that anthropology tends to focus on, the idea that there must be something more than just the basic acts of behaviour. What people don't just randomly behave in a certain way, it has meaning for them. So we're going to spend the rest of the time this evening looking at the voices of these people who participated in the study that I conducted between 2002 and 2005, or 6 or 7, or whatever it went on for. And so there are a range of perspectives which I would argue that these participants in this study offered. And as you can see there, I suggest it's an alternative perspective. It's different from a medicalised discourse. It's more holistic. It embraces a range of phenomena. I would argue there was a culture, there was a varied culture of use. One of the first things, I did a couple of focus groups when I first started, and I said to people, well, is there such a thing as cannabis culture? And there were 2 different focus groups, and they said, well, no, there's not one culture. There's all these, there's not one type of person who uses cannabis. All these different people use cannabis. And they all have different reasons for doing it. You'll notice here, the number one, collectively, number one set of things was around benefits. Now, if you remember back to last week, when we considered the type of people who were in that study, you may recall that about half of them were daily users. Okay? And so one of the things that we decided was that they were very enthusiastic about their cannabis use. And so in a sense, we should not be surprised that one of the things they talked most about was the benefits that they saw from using cannabis.